What they tried to do was that they suggested there was all sorts of nefarious intent and all of that. And A, that wasn't true. And B, it wasn't sufficient. The burden of providing a photo ID in order to vote is a minimal burden on Alabama's voters, especially when Alabama accepts so many different forms of photo ID and makes acquiring one simple and free for voters who lack a valid ID but wish to obtain one. So it's free if you want one. And they accept all sorts of photo ID. We've been out there trying to defend the rule of law and protect voter ID laws. We've I think we filed like half a dozen amicus briefs in North Carolina, but the left-wing courts in North Carolina tore apart the North Carolina voter ID law that was approved by its legislature and people. In Alabama, the left tried to challenge a voter ID law, and the good news is an appellate court, thanks in part, in my view, to Judicial Watch's amicus brief that we filed with our friends at the Allied Educational Foundation, which is a group also concerned about these issues and often partners with us in these types of amicus briefs. What is an amicus brief? It's a friend of court brief. It's a brief that organizations or people or groups can file in pending litigation, usually at the appellate or Supreme Court levels, either in the states or obviously in the Supreme Court at the federal level. That talk about the issues that are being litigated. So we're not necessarily parties, but we want the court to consider these issues. And what we did in Alabama was we highlighted the fact that they should not be able to, the left should not be able to knock out a law without showing there was any discriminatory intent or effect. Well, the effect thing, hold on one second. I want to be sure I said that right. So first of all, the good news is that the appellate court ruled and protected Alabama's voter ID law, which is, as I said, very generous. The court ruled that the 14th or 15th Amendments of the Voting Rights Act and that the anti-voter ID plaintiffs failed to demonstrate that the Alabama law causes the denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of race. And what they tried to do was that they suggested there was all sorts of nefarious intent and all of that. And A, that wasn't true. And B, it wasn't sufficient. With respect to the voter ID requirement itself, this is a basic truism. The burden of providing a photo ID in order to vote is a minimal burden on Alabama's voters, and frankly, anyone else's voters, especially when Alabama accepts so many different forms of photo ID and makes acquiring one simple and free for voters who lack a valid ID but wish to obtain one. So it's free if you want one. And they accept all sorts of photo ID. And that affirmed a lower court ruling that was put on appeal. So again, the left was trying to overturn a basic voter ID requirement. And as we highlighted in our amicus brief, the leftists trying to challenge the voter ID law failed to show a discriminatory. Well, this actually is quoting the, no, this is quoting us. The district court failed, excuse me, start over again. The left-wing plaintiffs failed to show a discriminatory result, let alone a discriminatory impact sufficient to rise to the level of a denial or abridgment of an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of choice. A racially disproportionate impact is not enough, nor is a history of discrimination, nor are the two in combination. Quite simply, the challenged ID procedure must be shown by plaintiffs to cause discriminatory results in order to prove a Section 2 violation, which of the Voting Rights Act, which is the big law that covers this. And this is the 11th Circuit, and they agreed with Judicial Watch's analysis here. In this case, there is no evidence that the challenged law either resulted in the denial or abridgment of the right to vote, or that such denial or abridgment of the right to vote was on account of race or color under Section 2. Lacking a showing of evidence necessary to demonstrate the sort of causal connection between racial bias and disparate effect necessary to make a voter denial claim dooms plaintiff's claims. I know that may sound complicated, but what they're trying to say is this is targeted at race specifically, and because it may affect some minorities, it means it ought to be thrown out. That's essentially what they're saying, and the court said that's not appropriate under law. Voter ID, the requirements apply to all voters. As I point out, it's a good policy. The left is dishonestly playing the race card to try to stop common sense voter ID laws here. And it's not just in Alabama, it's all over the place. They oppose all voter ID. Did you see Barack Obama this week at the John Lewis funeral? Making these false accusations of racial hostility behind those Americans of all races who support voter ID. I'm tired of the left playing the race card to try to undermine election security. Election security protects the votes of everyone. And they patronize minorities in suggesting they can't figure out how to get a photo ID. Of course, everyone has voter ID necessary to vote, and it's easily available. And the idea that somehow minorities are incapable of doing that is so patronizing. And of course, they don't believe it because they know it's not true. If it were true, you wouldn't have court decisions like you had in the Alabama case. I mean, and it's not just in Alabama. We had to file another brief on a similar matter in Arizona, the Ninth Circuit out there. There's a Supreme Court case at issue as well. Well, the left is playing the race card to overturn election security requirements in Arizona. Voter ID, citizenship verification, clean election rolls, vote in person, vote on election day. Be sure you're registered to vote before you show up to vote. Those are the sorts of things we need to be pushing. Vote by mail is a menace to free and fair elections. Simple. So we had some good news on a big case we had. I kind of get outraged even with the good news. We have been representing a former